Keeping your business healthy in today's marketplace can be a challenging and overwhelming task. From the threat of litigation inside and outside your organization and the inefficiencies that can rob your bottom line as a result of unproven marketing programs, the deck can be stacked against you. To get ahead of these challenges and stay ahead of your competition, the Bottled Business Sense Show provides practical business solutions that uniquely emphasize key legal principles, management techniques, and marketing strategies to protect and ensure the longevity of your business. You'll learn how to implement marketing and protection principles equal to those used by today's most successful corporations. Join your host, Bill Bernard, Rick Moscoso, and Steve Smith for some high-energy discussion that will inspire you to take control of your business so it can prosper in today's consistently challenging business environment.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Bottled Business Sense show here on this Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. As you know, we broadcast on Blog Talk Radio and through our own website in both audio and simulcast, respectively. We're here every week to keep your business protected and to make it sail along protected in that business bottle, so to speak, and make sure it has the proper marketing concepts in place to cause it to prosper and grow. And we enjoy providing this free information every week to our viewers and listeners. And without further ado, let me introduce my other two co-hosts, Rick Moscoso and Mr. Steve Smith, who's suffering from a bit of a cold. How are you guys today?
I'm doing great, Bill. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Okay.
That cold seems to be hanging on for quite a long time here, Steve.
Yeah, it has. I think
it's not like they used to be. You used to be able to just take a couple of pills and it'd be gone in a couple of days. The colds today, I mean, they hunker down. They're there for months.
Oh
So
my gosh,
well, you know what they say. You know what they say, Steve. The big hot tea, honey, with a big shot of Jack Daniels or something like that. It'll sweat it right out of you.
Well, I use that recipe, except I just eliminate the hot tea and the honey.
There you go. All right. Well, today, I've had, I should say, a lot of questions by clients who a lot of them are employers, and they have questions about what can I do to make sure I get a good employee? That is to say, what kind of a check can I do on an employee or prospective employee, really, that will ensure that I get somebody of sound character? And I thought we'd talk a little bit about that today. And essentially, there's two major checks that employers do. One is a consumer background check, and the other is a criminal background check. Both of them provide some insight into a prospective employee's background for a little bit different reasons. But I think in the end, it all goes to what an employer believes is going to be the character of the person he's thinking about hiring, he or she. So I thought we'd start it off with a criminal background check. That seems to be the most quote-unquote popular nowadays, the most controversial. And I thought, guys, that what I'd do is start out by telling you what an employer cannot do, which will immediately call into question what he can do. So let's start by saying that basically an employer cannot investigate an arrest or ask about an arrest that's more than 7 years old. So if you're within that 7-year window, it's not something that he's going to find out or should find out by way of a legitimate report that he runs. And also any conviction for which you were released or paroled or which otherwise was disposed of more than 7 years ago. So remember, an arrest and a conviction are two different things. What they have in common is if they're more than 7 years old, whether you've been arrested or whether you have been convicted is not fair game for an employer. So if an employer is doing that, he's not being on the up and up, and bad things can happen.
Okay, so let me throw this scenario at you, and you tell me how you would advise an employer. Okay?
Yes, sir. Let's hear it.
You know about the sexual sexual conviction, sexual predator website. where people can go on and find out if there's folks living in their neighborhood that have ever been convicted of a sexual crime. Those things don't seem to have any statute of limitations on them.
Mm-hmm.
So if an employer happens to go out and does a random bunch of checks, and they come across a site that they find out the person they're looking to hire, or maybe somebody that's already been there for a couple of years, is listed on one of these sex offender websites for something they did 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
What can they do with that, or what do you think they would do with that?
Great question, and a real good answer is coming up, and that's this. Remember when now we're going to talk a little bit like a lawyer, which I try to refrain from doing on the show a lot, but remember that I said the report cannot contain something over 7 years old, an arrest or conviction. So that means that when you go get somebody to prepare a written report for you, it's supposed to follow these guidelines. It also means that when an employee gives you a report, which could be verbal, he or she doesn't have to divulge this. But you have, in essence, jumped to the end of the show, Steve, and I'll tell you how. Because in the end, an employer can do what he wants to do on his own to find out what he wants and never has to reveal it, right? And here's why. Because in California, you're an at-will employee. And somebody just coming on the job, if an employer knows something about him that the employer believes will affect the character of the prospective employee, he or she doesn't have to hire that person. So any due diligence they do on their own is basically going to be due diligence that they can do on their own and don't have to reveal. They never even have to say why they don't want to hire you. We decided to hire somebody else.
All right, so let me throw another one at you, because I work with business owners on a variety of management issues and how to run the business and how to market it. But when you're talking about the management side, frequently we get into upgrading the staff or dealing with people that just aren't a good fit performance-wise or some other reason. So inevitably, they're out looking for replacements. They're looking for new people.
Right.
Now, I only have one client who has a business where it's kind of mandated that they do a fairly in-depth criminal background check because of the nature of what the business is, and they have government contracts and things like that. Everybody else that I work with doesn't tend to go down that road. They'll do the easy things. They'll check the references. They'll go on Facebook, social media. They'll try to figure out if there's anything there they should be aware of. But it's fairly, it's just above the surface. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what if an employer just by routine does not do an extensive criminal background check? Let's say that the most they do is they check out the driver's license to make sure the person has a valid license and that nothing else pops up.
Right.
And later on, after the person's been hired and has been there for a number of years and is a satisfactory employee,
right.
Let's say they get into something else that causes them to want to go back and do criminal background checks for all their people, and they come up with something.
Right.
Is that employee, can they, even though they didn't ask for it the first time, so the employee probably felt, okay, it was a thing that came and went and it's over with and I'm a different person today. And they didn't divulge that because they weren't asked about it. Right. And the employer now changes their employee or their performance, their hiring specifications, and they start doing this. Can they retroactively go back and fire that employee because they found something now that they weren't looking for earlier on?
Sure, absolutely. If that person is an at-will employee, if that person, and remember, at-will employment is the rule in California, unless you have an implied-in-fact contract where you've been working for a company for a very long time, and you can establish by an implied contract that you can only be fired for a reasonable cause, and that is an issue for another show. Or if your civil rights have been violated, then you cannot be fired at will. But other than those things, an employer can fire you. So if the employer decides to do a check at some point in time after you've been retained as an employee, he can certainly fire you if he or she chooses to do so. Now remember that you can, this is analogous to changing a policy. businesses change their policies and their practices all the time. So if they decide to institute a check where they didn't have one before, that's perfectly legitimate. And if they don't feel they want to keep the employee, and that employee is still on an at-will status, where there's no contract written or implied and no violation of their civil rights, boom, they can let them go.
Okay.
Another thing that the employer can't do is to, obviously, it goes without saying, really, they can't dismiss somebody for a crime where the person's been fully pardoned. But let's get into some of the more interesting ones where a prospective employer in California may not ask an employee about arrests or detentions, as we said, that did not result in a conviction. He or she may not ask about arrests for which you have successfully completed drug diversion programs. The employer may not ask if you personally use marijuana. The employer may not inquire as to whether you have had any juvenile arrests or convictions. And that would go hand in hand with any convictions at all that have been expunged or legally eradicated. For example, let's go back to the first example where you're within the 7-year period. You could actually have a conviction expunged, and if that conviction is expunged and it's within the 7-year period, which would typically be fair game, if an employer asks a prospective employee about that, the employee can legitimately say, no, I don't have that conviction or that arrest.
All right. So one of the things you did mention was the employer cannot ask if the employee has ever, what are we talking about? Just ever used drugs in general or marijuana specifically?
No, specifically marijuana. And the employer cannot ask about other types of drug convictions where a diversion program has been successfully completed. But you certainly can ask somebody if they use, heroin or cocaine or things of that nature.
So marijuana has been kind of relegated to a drug that doesn't carry any penalty.
Yes, only if, and this is one thing I neglected to point out. So let's go back over that, Steve. I'm glad you brought it up. Personal marijuana use which are related to an offense involving marijuana, which is more than 2 years old. So if it's less than 2 years old, you can say to a prospective employee, have you had any marijuana convictions, that are less than 2 years old?
Okay, because see, while I don't see a lot of evidence that employers are using real extensive criminal background checks other than, checking with the DMV to, make sure nobody's got anything on their record that way. What I do see more and more using are drug testing programs.
Yes.
And they have their employees sign documents saying that at any point during the time you're working here, I can mandate that you go have a drug test.
Yep.
And you got to go do it. So if somebody has got a regular marijuana habit, and they have that stuff in their system, and it comes back positive in a drug test, now are they in jeopardy?
Yes, only if this occurs. And this was covered. We actually did a show on this, Steve, before you joined us. It's back in our archives in case anybody's interested. If you put employees on notice, in other words, if you give them the right to say, to be advised, listen, we here at our company do drug tests, and we do periodic drug tests. You are now on notice with everybody else that you can be tested. And so you have been forewarned. Okay? If you are an employee and the company changes their policy and decides they want to do drug tests, and they tell everybody and give them warning, then typically drug tests are something that employers do. But to not advise people that drug tests are going to be given, or to single out and only give certain employees drug tests, that's not typically going to hold up in court. And there, as I said, we did a show on that. Also, misdemeanor convictions for which probation was completed. You have a misdemeanor conviction, you've gone to probation, probation's been completed, it's not something you have to tell your employer about. So that's generally speaking what you have to remember about background tests as it covers criminal background. But there's also another test, Steve, and I think you may even run into this in your business and Rick, and that's consumer credit report checks, because sometimes they can be just as detrimental. Do you want to hire an employee who may owe somebody $50,000 or $100,000 and has a bad credit rating? Because that might make that employee more susceptible to just suing you to try to get some money at some point in time to pay off a debt.
Well, I actually had a client many, many years ago that he was in the wholesale jewelry business. And when he looked for salespeople, not only would they be selling his product, but they would be carrying samples. And so they had to be of the highest, they had to pass the highest amount of scrutiny because what they had in their possession was worth a lot of money. Mm-hmm. So he would do the credit check, because he didn't want somebody who either had heavy loads of debt or had filed for bankruptcy, because all that told him was that they were not responsible with handling money in general. And so if they couldn't handle their own, what made him think they were going to handle his any better? They would look for the drug stuff. They would look for the the DMV stuff. And he never really mentioned, I didn't ask him whether he got into any in-depth, criminal background checks, probably given the merchandise they were carrying. But yeah, you're right. Depending on the kind of business the person has, depending on what the business owner is trying to avoid in bringing people into his business or into her business,
right?
They're gonna look for things, because this is what I personally believe. Okay, if you hire somebody who's had convictions for some sexual crimes, they've had drug convictions, maybe they got in a car accident and manslaughter. If something like that is coming out, okay, look, people at work are gonna find out. I mean, the gossip pool at work inevitably uncovers stuff like this. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of times they're just fearful of having somebody in the workplace that may cast aspersions about why is that person here. Now, on the flip side, you say, okay, everybody that really makes a good effort to straighten their life out deserves a second chance.
Good point.
So you as the owner have really got to balance and really have a strong culture in place, so that if somebody like that shows up and despite the fact they've got a record of some kind, they've proven themselves in the technical expertise that they do. Yep. They've got good references from other places they've worked at. Then you've got to make that call as to what value outweighs what possible, whatever, that people are going to find out when they find out somebody's got a record of some kind.
Well, that's a great point, Steve, because, that's, I think, the whole point of our show, to really show business owners they really need some professionals on their team, because they've got tough decisions to make along the way. And I think the most successful businesses have people that can give them sound, good advice. But you mentioned, that was a good segue, you mentioned management. One of the things that I didn't point out yet and that I was getting to is you may not use a consumer credit report for employment purposes unless, number one, it's for a management position. Okay? Number two, it's for a position in the State Department of Justice. Number three, if it's a position as a sworn peace officer. Number four, where there is information contained in the report that's required by law to be disclosed, such as a sexual offender. Number five, a position involving confidential personal information or trade secrets, where you're going to be handling that type of material. A position that involves regular access to cash totaling $10,000. That would be number six. I mean, the list can get a little more intricate, but in other words, some person coming in off the street who's going to be your receptionist is not the appropriate target for a consumer credit report. So you're going to have these enumerated positions in the state of California that require that will allow, I should say, an employer to do this. Now, remember, number one is the most important, isn't it? Because really, you can get pretty creative and put just about almost anything under a quote-unquote management position. Well, they're going to be you don't even have to call somebody a manager. You can say, well, you're going to be in a management position because you're going to be responsible for helping certain employees. Now, that's not to say somebody can't challenge you on that if they wanted to, and if it got to a point where they wanted to go, to bat on that. But what I'm saying is you can get creative And let's face it, even if you don't get creative, your management positions typically in your company are going to be the most important ones anyway, right? They're going to be responsible for decision making and handling other people.
Yeah, I mean, that's typically how it should work. Not every business is set up to take maximum advantage of that, but
that's a good point.
That's the way it's supposed to work, yes.
And I know that's the way it works in Rick's company, right, Rick?
Yeah, thank you.
No, I mean, you've got some decisions to make. I mean, let's face it, you hire somebody to go out and help you with a shoot, Rick, and you have them handling this valuable equipment and stuff. You want to make sure you've got somebody with some sound background. But, there may be sometimes there may be an issue where you're not going to be able to go to the full extent like getting a consumer credit report, but you certainly might be able to run a criminal background check. So these are the types of things, that need to be checked up on and need to have sound advice given to our business owners.
I wonder in the industry of insurance, whether you're selling automobile insurance or home insurance or life insurance, or because more and more insurance agents today are getting licensed to be able to sell other type of financial instruments that get more into investment side as opposed to just the insurance side. I wonder if that industry has requirements about people who have to go out and get licensed and to be hired by an insurance company or insurance broker. If that automatically goes with with the background check, that they have to be checked for a criminal history, because certainly you wouldn't want anybody on your team suggesting certain life insurance or other types of investment vehicles if they've had crimes against them, because that certainly wouldn't make you look good as the business owner.
Yeah, and that's true, Steve. And I think that would go without saying. You'd want to get a criminal check, and I think if it's a management position, you'd certainly want to get a consumer credit check as well. And don't forget, one of the ones I mentioned, if you're handling, if you have access to cash of $10,000 or more, that word cash can be, used in a very creative way. And if you're an insurance agent with access to a lot of money, that could potentially come into play too. That's an interesting that's an interesting examination of how strict that one particular requirement might be. But the bottom line is, this is the prudent thing to do. And are you mature enough and are you a savvy enough business owner to do what you said, Steve, and that is temper it with, hey, look, let me look at this background. If I find something, is it in the nature of which I think maybe this person would have been able to pay his dues to society and move on? And I think that's when you start contacting the references. Remember, everybody, make sure you have great references. You ask for great references when you're doing an interview for a prospective employee. You want to check on those references, just the same as you would when you're going to hire a plumber or whoever else. You may say, hey, do you have any references? Why would you not do that for a prospective employee?
Well, I think a lot of businesses, in fact, a lot of small businesses that I work with use these third-party HR outfits. Mm-hmm. They outsource it because a lot of times, the team that they have, they don't have the expertise. They can't afford to pay for a position in the company like that. So they'll go to ADP, they'll go to some other type of third-party administrator to help them with that side of it. And some of these companies mandate that if you're going to hire somebody, here is our list that you have to go through and complete. Otherwise, we're not going to cover you should something go wrong. So more and more of them are getting like that. And I just think that in a lot of cases, even though it may not be necessarily the right thing to do, more times than not, employers are looking for ways to discount who they're looking at and be able to say, hey, you don't fit our criteria because of this, and that, and just make and play it safe. They don't want to step out on the edge and take the risk So, because you don't know what's going to happen later on. I mean, you may have hired somebody that years and years ago got caught up in some financial dealings, and they got a record for that. And you may have another employee in your office already working there who was the victim of something like that and never told anybody. And all of a sudden this stuff comes out, and now you've got a homegrown issue that you've got to deal with in your own company. So I think a lot of times the default is, if there's anything out there, if we find them, being held upside down and drinking on Facebook, we're just not going to hire them. We're just going to make it clean and easy.
And I'll say in closing the show that the only problem I have with those companies, no one in specific, but the type of companies you mentioned that people rely on, Steve, in general, is they do a lot of what the LegalZoom and those types of sites do. They go beyond employment characterization, and they attempt to practice law in many instances. And I would just forewarn all of our viewers and listeners, don't go for that. Well, in any event, I want to say thank you, gentlemen, for participating in the show. I hope this was helpful to our viewers and listeners. I hope that they have a better understanding of what they can and can't do, and that they realize that this is an ongoing progression to make them understand, or help them understand the relationship between an employer and employee, and the obligations you have to each other in order to have a smooth running business, so you don't get taken down to a visit on the courthouse steps, because that's what we want to try to prevent, right?
Absolutely.
So with that, I'll say good day. I hope everybody has a prosperous week. And again, Steve and Rick, thanks for participating, and we'll see you next week.
Okay. Enjoy it. We'll talk next week.
All right, Bill. Thanks for a great episode. See you, folks.